Welcome to my review of the Strike Freedom Gundam. I am going to try and be as objective as possible, but as with any review, these are ultimately going to be my own opinions and my own take. I'm going to talk about what I liked, what I didn't so much like, what I felt could be improved to make a better kit. So I'm going to go over briefly what I looked at. I looked at 5 categories. I looked at aesthetics. I looked at details. I looked at the build itself, the articulation, and I looked at the accessories. If you want to know a little bit more about how I scored everything, I'll have that in the description below. So to start with, I want to look at and talk about the aesthetics. I divided it into 2 categories, the overall look and whatever really just popped out, either for good or bad. With the overall look, the first thing that I really liked was that the Strike Freedom has a lot of more organic curves in the legs, in the torso, etc. It's not as blocky as some of the earlier mech designs from the Gundam series. Another thing that I like that is fairly special with this particular mech is the amount of frame that is exposed. The armor plates do not cover the entire mech, and that adds a really nice splash of color throughout the model. Similar to the arm exposed frame, the Strike Freedom Gundam also has some extra plating that kind of gives it a look of being more heavily armored, but without some of the bulkier I'm wearing a great big suit of armor looks that are present in a lot of the more heavily armored mechs. Finally, something else I liked was just the sheer number of vents that are on this particular mech. They're everywhere. However, one thing on the overall look that I don't really care for, and this is 100% purely my own opinion, are the shoulders. I'm not that big a fan of pointy shoulders. I prefer shoulders that are a little bit more boxed off, not exactly square, but just a little bit more so. As to the things that just really stand out about this, there are 2. The first is the wing articulation. The way the wings spread out is just visually impressive. It's really phenomenal. Um, However, one thing that I don't really care for is that this particular model, when it's fully built, cannot really stand up on its own. The wings are just too heavy. And if you try and stand it up straight, the model will just fall backwards. The second category was details. And again, I divided it into 2 categories. The first is details that are based in pieces, and then details in the sculpt of the individual pieces. So regarding pieces, one thing that I liked is that the Dragoon pods on the wing unit are detachable. However, They don't have a lot of detail to them. They are just simply two pieces clamshelled together. Um, Being able to detach them means that you can do more with them, but the I would have really liked a little bit more color, a little bit more design, a little bit more to just break up the box, as it were. They are a lot of vents in there. Again, I mentioned that I liked the fact that there were vents all over. Some of those vents are in the sculpt, but many of them are actual vents that snap into place, vent covers, and those are really nice. The other detail element that I really liked was how many of the armor plates have little cutouts, little cutaways or holes that allow you to see a little bit of the frame from underneath. Those are all nice little details. Um, in the sculpt, similarly to the other, um, there are also a lot of really small details in this particular model that just aren't present on an HG level. Um, most of those details are like really small vents, things like that, but there are also a lot of those. The third category is the build itself. So the first thing was how fun it was, things that were especially fun or not fun, and also things that were difficult or that really worked or that didn't work. So things that increased difficulty. Um, on the fun side, I like the fact that the skirting on the Strike Freedom Gundam is completely individual plates. Um, the HGs I've built with skirting were a front plate that's all connected and a back that's all connected, and I've others have like the front or the back is individual, but the other one is not. With the Strike Freedom, it is actually four individual pieces that really adds to the level of posability as well, and the look when it's being positioned. Another thing that really stands out in the build is the hand. Um, in addition to having a posable thumb, it has an individually articulating forefinger, and then the other three fingers articulate together. This is really nice because it means you don't have to constantly switch out different hands depending on what kind of pose you want to do. It does have a downside, however, in that it limits you to some degree on the poses that you can get with your hand. The final thing that I really like that was really fun is the cockpit. Um, because it just slides open. It's very easy to open and it's very easy to expose the pilot. The downside is that it is very small, a very small opening, and even with the cockpit open, it is difficult to see. A couple of negatives on the side of building. The first thing was the wing articulation mechanism. I've already stated that I really loved the wing articulation. Unfortunately, the actual internal mechanism that handles all that is the somewhat softer plastic used for the frame, the gold. In my opinion, it would have been better to use a harder plastic. Some of those pieces are very, very small, and I actually had some get damaged. They put stress on it and actually weakened those already softer plastic pieces. So I do think that a harder plastic would be better for the internal workings of the wing. The other thing is the rail guns on the skirting, on the waist unit. Um, they do move to the back, which is really nice, which is wonderful, but they're also very loosely set in because they have to be able to rotate to the back. The ball and socket joint is of necessity somewhat loose, and I find that almost every time I switch them around, open them up, or anything, one or both of them seems to pop out, and so I have to put it back. It's a minor annoyance most of the time, but it is an issue. Number 4 is the articulation. And just as with all of the others, I broke this into 2 categories. The first is range of articulation, and the second is posability. I'm not looking at the range of articulation of everything, just the range of articulation of things that I felt was especially good or especially bad. So the first thing was the wings. Um, the wings have swivel joints and the opening, and they really can articulate just as far as you want. They can move up, they can move down, they can open up, they can be forward or more backward. You can get a lot of dynamic just from how you choose to set the wings. The head is also nice in that it has a fairly broad range of motion. The forward and backward tilt are both fairly high, and even when you turn the head to the side, which I found frequently restricts how far forward or backward it can tilt, it retains a lot of that tilt. The hips are great as well. The legs of the mech um, are in the hips in such a way that they can actually turn and rotate in the hips as well as bending outward, allowing for a much more natural positioning and posing in the mech, especially if you wanted to do a kneeling or running or flying pose. The knees also have a pretty much 180 bend in them because they are double jointed knees rather than single jointed. And then, but finally, I've got the arms. One thing I like is for my arms to be able to rotate. And unfortunately, um, while the arms will move forward, they'll move back. The shoulder can rotate vertically up and down. The arm itself is locked in place by one of those wonderful little armor pieces. And so the arm cannot actually rotate along its length. This limits you a little bit in your ability to pose it. Regarding posability, however, there is a lot of variety, again, because of those hips, those knees, and the head, um, that you can get in your posability. There's a lot of different positions you can put it in. On the other hand, the Strike Freedom's joints are a little bit loose, which leads to the final issue I have with posability. The stand, while obviously made to work with the Strike Freedom Gundam, I have found is itself a little bit loose, and it has a couple of joints that tend to pop loose really easily. Finally, I'm going to look at the accessories, the weapons, as it were. First, I'm going to look at the variety of the weapons. Then I want to look at just how easily do they equip, how easy is it to put them on the mech. As to variety, there are 3 basic weapons. First, we have the beam rifles, and the beam rifles actually have some really nice variety. They can be either put on the hips with the railguns to the back. They can be held individually in the 2 hands, or they can be held as a single long cannon unit. Second are the beam sabers. And while they do not have quite as much versatility as the beam rifles, they still have a fair bit. First of all, of course, they can be held in the hands separately, either one or both of them, but you can also put them together as a sort of beam staff, similar to a very famous double-bladed energy weapon from a different universe. Finally, you have the shield, and it is a beam shield rather than a physical shield, which is nice in that it does not completely block view of the arms or anything held in the hands. And also the way in which it attaches to the arm is actually especially nice. But that does bring us to actually equipping the devices onto the mech itself. First of all, I like that absolutely everything can be held by the mech at all times. It doesn't matter which weapon you want to have equipped, the other weapons can be stored on the mech. And that's just a really nice touch. Unfortunately, there are a couple of downsides. The first is that the beam rifles are very loose in the hands. After even yet about a month of playing with it, from when I finished, I have not been able to get the beam rifles to hold in the hands securely. So putting them in there is always a matter of putting them in, positioning them, and kind of hoping they stay. As to if it's in its beam cannon configuration, it's really visually stunning, but again, almost impossible to get it to stay. So that is a definite downside. The other thing is that the beam shield is nice, but it tends to hit the shoulders. That is, again, partly because they're pointy. You can rotate the shield, but that again messes with the look of it a little bit. So it does tend to hit the shoulders. So when I took everything there then individually, I gave the aesthetics a score of 9.5, the details a score of 9, the build a score of 6.5, the articulation an 8.5, and the accessories a 9. I went ahead, added everything else, and averaged it out, which gave the Strike Freedom Gundam a final score of an 8.5 out of 10. Again, if you want to know more about how I scored, I will have a description of how I came up with all of those individual scores in the description below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.